Imagine being a 16-year-old girl battling cancer, flying alone to a distant city for treatment, only to face public humiliation from someone who is supposed to help. What happened next was more than just a personal struggle. It ignited a fight for justice that would spark a national movement. Stay tuned to uncover how one small, quiet voice led to a transformative change. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The terminal at Austin Bergstrom International Airport hummed with the usual flurry of activity. Announcements blaring, footsteps echoing, passengers hurrying past, wheeling luggage, and clutching boarding passes. Amidst the chaos, Ellery Harper stood frozen, gripping the handle of her small carry-on bag, her fingers tightening around it as if it were the only thing anchoring her in the whirlwind of motion around her. At 16, she had faced more hardship than most could imagine. She scanned the departure board, eyes locked on the bold letters of her flight to New York. The city's name stared back at her, but it felt like an impenetrable wall rather than a destination. Ellery took a deep breath, adjusting her knit cap. Beneath it was her wig, an artifact of the life she once knew. Her scalp, smooth and bare from months of chemotherapy, served as a silent, constant reminder of the battle she was fighting. She shifted uncomfortably, the soft squeak of her sneakers barely audible on the polished floor. It wasn't the flight itself she dreaded. It wasn't the heights or turbulence that caused her stomach to churn. It was the stares, the looks, the whispers, the stares when people realized she wasn't just a quiet teen, she was a sick one. This trip to New York, to receive more cancer treatment, felt heavier than the rest. Perhaps it was because her father wasn't flying with her this time. The memory of his hasty, impersonal goodbye at the curb lingered in her chest, a heavy weight she couldn't shake. "Call me when you land," he'd said, barely looking up from his laptop. The coldness in his voice echoed in her mind as she moved toward security. A chill breeze hit her face as she passed through the automatic doors. She pulled her coat tighter around her, trying to steady herself. Her father, Judge Harper, had always been distant, his way of showing love wrapped in practical arrangements, like booking her a seat at the front of the plane with more legroom. It wasn't much, but it was the best he could offer. She sank into the seat, glancing at the couple beside her. They barely acknowledged her presence. The flight attendant who greeted her with a clipped "hello" did nothing to ease her discomfort. The flight attendant, Becky, was polite at first, but when she checked Ellery's boarding pass, her expression shifted. "You're in the wrong seat," she said, her voice flat. Confused, Ellery explained, "My dad arranged this seat for me. The number's right here." Becky's lips tightened as she waved her off. "We'll see about that," she muttered, before marching off to the front of the plane. The minutes ticked by in uncomfortable silence. Ellery could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the noise of passengers settling in blending into the low hum of the engines. The air felt thick, heavy, like a storm was brewing just outside. When Becky returned, it wasn't with an apology. Her face was set, her posture rigid as she handed back Ellery's boarding pass with a curt, "Stay here for now." Without another word, she turned away, leaving Ellery to stew in her growing sense of unease. The whispers among the passengers grew louder, sharp, and cutting. Some looked at her with pity, others with curiosity. No one spoke up. Moments later, Becky returned, this time with more force in her voice. "This seat doesn't match your ticket," she said, her tone colder. "You'll need to move." Ellery's breath hitched. "But my dad," she started, but Becky interrupted her. "I don't care what your dad said. Rules are rules." The words stung. They sliced through Ellery like a slap, leaving her frozen, humiliated. Around her, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glancing her way, others avoiding her gaze entirely. The tension in the cabin grew unbearable. It was then that Becky reached forward, her hand almost casually brushing the top of Ellery's knit cap, yanking it off her head. The room seemed to hold its breath. Gasps rippled through the rows as Ellery's wig was exposed, an awkward, synthetic mess of hair that had been her attempt at normalcy amidst her illness. "Passengers in premium seats are expected to maintain a certain appearance," Becky announced. her voice dripping with disdain as she held the cap up for everyone to see, as if it were an exhibit in a museum. The cruel irony of her words stung harder than anything else. Ellery's face flushed red with embarrassment, and her hands instinctively shot up to adjust the wig, but her fingers trembled too much to do anything. The cabin fell silent. The murmurs from other passengers grew louder. Someone muttered, "Poor girl," while another quietly said, "Can you believe she did that?" But no one intervened. No one came to Ellery's defense. In that moment, Ellery's mind raced. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into the rain streaking the window beside her, but she couldn't. She couldn't escape the suffocating weight of public humiliation. Her vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes, but she fought to hold them back. A sob caught in her throat, but she bit it down. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms, trying desperately to steady her shaking body. She wanted to shout, to demand an apology, but the words felt like shards of glass lodged in her throat, too painful to speak. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, amplifying the weight of every stare. Becky's cruel words still hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was then that Yvonne Carter, a woman in her late 40s seated across the aisle, noticed Ellery's silent struggle. Yvonne had seen too much in her years as a pediatric oncology nurse. Too many children like Ellery, fighting silent battles with strength masked by fear. And just like that, she knew she couldn't remain silent. Yvonne's mind flooded with memories of Connor, a 14-year-old boy she had cared for, a boy whose laughter once filled the halls of the hospital before cancer took him far too soon. The resemblance between him and Ellery was undeniable, not in appearance but in that quiet strength, that overwhelming fear of being seen as fragile. The flight attendant's actions had struck a nerve in Yvonne. She couldn't sit back any longer. The injustice was too glaring. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the hum of the engines muffled the whispers around them. Yvonne couldn't ignore what had just happened. The cruel, dismissive treatment of a vulnerable girl couldn't go unchallenged. With a deep breath, Yvonne rose from her seat, walking toward Becky as she passed. The woman's polished exterior, her posture of authority, did nothing to mask the cruelty she had just displayed. Yvonne stood firm, her voice calm but resolute. "What you did was wrong," she said, her words cutting through the tense silence of the cabin. "You humiliated her. You need to apologize." Becky stiffened, her eyes narrowing, but Yvonne didn't back down. She couldn't. Not this time. In the moments that followed, as the plane continued its taxi to the runway, Ellery sat frozen in her seat. But for the first time that day, she felt something shift within her, something like hope. It was small, but it was there. Maybe, just maybe, there was power in speaking out. Maybe one voice could change the course of things. Ellery sat frozen on her bed, her phone still clenched tightly in her hands as the chime of an incoming email rang from downstairs. Her pulse quickened, anxiety creeping up her spine like a dark cloud. Yvonne had written to her father, and now, as the seconds stretched on, it felt as though the world was holding its breath. The weight of the situation pressed down on her. She hadn't been ready for her father to know. Not like this. Not through someone else's words. She had always felt invisible to him, and now, in this moment, she feared what his reaction might be. Would he understand? Would he be disappointed in her? Or would this revelation bring some kind of shift between them? Downstairs, the soft murmur of her father's voice filtered through the walls, though it was too muffled to make out the exact words. But Ellery knew what was happening. He was reading the email. The walls of their house seemed to close in on her as she fought to steady her breath. Her fingers tightened around the phone, almost as though she could hold off the inevitable with her grip. But she knew she couldn't. She would have to face whatever this new chapter brought, whether she was ready or not. After what felt like an eternity, she stood from the bed, legs shaky as she walked to the door. Every step felt deliberate, each one an effort to gather the courage to face her father. She knew she couldn't avoid this confrontation forever. Downstairs, her father's office door was slightly ajar. Ellery hesitated, staring at the familiar wood, wondering if she should knock or if she should just walk in and face him. Her breath caught in her throat, but she took another step. Before she could lift her hand to push the door open, Judge Harper's voice called out to her. His tone was softer now, less distant than it had been earlier. "Ellery, come in," he said, his voice betraying a hint of concern. With one final deep breath, Ellery walked into the room, the soft creak of the door breaking the silence between them. Her father was sitting at his desk, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose, eyes focused on the screen in front of him. But as soon as he saw her, his expression shifted. The stern look softened, and he pushed his chair back, standing up. "Ellery, He stopped mid-sentence, seemingly unsure of how to proceed. His gaze flicked to the computer screen where the email from Yvonne had been opened, then back to his daughter. There was something different in his eyes, a flicker of realization. "I got your message," he said quietly. "And I want to talk about it. About what happened on the plane." Ellery felt a lump form in her throat. She had imagined this moment in countless ways, but now that it was here, she was unsure of how to respond. Her father had always been a man of logic and rules, someone who believed in justice above all else. She didn't know if his sense of justice would lead him to stand by her or if he would side with the flight attendant. Would he believe her? Ellery started, her voice shaky, unsure of how to express the weight of everything she had experienced. "I didn't want you to know like this." "I know," he said softly, his tone more understanding than she had expected. "I can't imagine how difficult today must have been for you." Ellery swallowed hard. It wasn't just the flight. It was everything. The way she treated me. The way everyone just sat there like nothing was happening. Judge Harper's face tightened, and for the first time in a long while, Ellery saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes. "I'm sorry you went through that, Ellery. No one should ever have to endure something like that." His voice was firm, filled with the authority she had always known him for, but now tinged with a layer of empathy. Ellery felt a rush of emotions, relief, anger, confusion, all swirling together in a chaotic storm. She had been waiting for someone to see her, to understand what she had been through, and now, in this moment, it seemed that her father was finally starting to see her, not just as his daughter, but as her own person, with her own struggles. "I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do it alone," her father replied, his voice low and steady. "We'll figure this out, together." For the first time in a long while, Ellery felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, things could start to change. The sudden appearance of Yvonne Carter at the press conference was almost like a breath of fresh air for Ellery. The nurse, who had been a steady presence during the tense moments on the plane, now stood in the crowd, her posture confident and grounded. Yvonne's face softened with a reassuring smile as she caught Ellery's eye from the side. For a split second, Ellery felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Yvonne had been there when she needed someone, had believed in her when it felt like everyone else would let her down. Now, standing in front of reporters and cameras, Ellery wasn't sure she could do this alone, but seeing Yvonne there reminded her that she wasn't. The murmurs in the crowd shifted as Yvonne stepped forward, her presence calm but undeniable. She looked directly at the reporters who had all been expecting the judge's statement. But now, it seemed, they were eager to hear more from the woman who had stood by Ellery on the plane. "I've spent my career working with people who are vulnerable," Yvonne began, her voice steady and unyielding. "And what I witnessed on that flight was not just an abuse of power. It was a violation of trust. No one, especially a young person, should ever feel that their worth is up for debate in public." Her words hung in the air, punctuated by the flash of cameras as reporters scribbled notes. The weight of Yvonne's experience, her compassion, and her unflinching honesty made it clear that she was a woman who had seen too much injustice not to speak out. She continued, her gaze shifting to Ellery, who stood beside her father, still tense but now filled with an unspoken resolve. "Ellery deserves an apology, but more than that, she deserves respect. We all do, and it's time we stop accepting anything less." The crowd was silent for a moment, taking in the gravity of her statement. Then, as if the dam had broken, questions began to fly. Yvonne answered each one with a calm authority that left no room for doubt. She wasn't just a witness, she was a fighter for what was right, and she made it clear that she wasn't going to let the airline sweep this under the rug. When the press conference wrapped up, Ellery felt a sense of accomplishment that had been building inside her for weeks. She wasn't just a victim of an isolated incident anymore. She was part of something bigger, something that could change how people were treated when they were at their most vulnerable. As they walked off the stage, Ellery looked up at her father. Harper's face was still set, but there was a hint of pride in his eyes. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, offering silent support. "You did well, Ellery," he said quietly, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Ellery felt the weight of his approval, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the beginning of something new, a shift, not just in the world outside, but within herself. As they left the courthouse, the crowd of reporters following behind them slowly began to disperse. Yvonne fell into step beside Ellery, her presence reassuring as always. "You did great up there," Yvonne said with a smile. "You spoke your truth, that's powerful." Ellery nodded, a small but genuine smile curving her lips. "I don't think I could have done it without you." "You didn't have to," Yvonne replied softly. "You had it in you all along. You just needed to see it for yourself." And for the first time, Ellery believed her. She had seen it now, the strength, the courage, and the conviction to stand up for herself. It wasn't easy, but it was hers. As they walked out of the courthouse, the morning sun breaking through the clouds, Ellery couldn't help but feel a small sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. And with people like Yvonne and her father beside her, maybe, just maybe, things would change for the better. Rallied behind her, amplifying her message of dignity and respect for all passengers, regardless of their background or needs. The momentum built as more voices joined the conversation, and the public outcry against Regency Airlines grew louder. The day following Ellery's interview, the airline was forced to confront the growing tide of anger and demand for accountability. While Regency Airlines issued another statement claiming they were conducting a thorough review, their efforts to manage the crisis were met with widespread skepticism. For many, the damage was already done. Regardless of how long it took the airline to come to a decision, their reputation had been irrevocably tarnished. Back at home, Harper and Ellery continued to prepare for the next steps. The pressure from the public was mounting, but so was their resolve. Harper's experience in the legal world, combined with Ellery's newfound courage, made them a formidable team. Despite the personal toll the situation was taking on Ellery, she still wrestled with the criticism and the weight of public scrutiny. Her father remained a constant source of support. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, Harper took a seat beside Ellery. "You're doing something bigger than just yourself, Ellery," he said softly. "You're helping to change the way people think about respect and accountability. And even if it feels hard right now, know that you're not doing it alone. I'm right here beside you, every step of the way." Ellery nodded, the weight of his words grounding her. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again, the suffocating pressure of doubt loosening its grip on her. She wasn't just telling her own story, she was helping to bring light to something much larger, something that had long been ignored. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid to walk it. With her father's unwavering support and the backing of advocacy groups, Ellery was ready for whatever came next. Together, they would continue to push for justice and change, ensuring that the voices of those who had been mistreated would finally be heard. The fight wasn't over, but Ellery now had the strength to see it through to the end. Ellery's story emphasizes resilience, the importance of speaking up, and the ripple effect that one person's voice can have on a larger societal scale. She transitions from being a victim of injustice to becoming an advocate for those in similar struggles, embodying the power of change that starts with an individual but grows through collective effort. Through this journey, Ellery shows that even in the face of hardship, there are opportunities to rise, inspire, and create lasting change for others.